strange old house stood at the edge of a quiet village, surrounded by tall, dry trees and an unsettling silence that seemed to linger even during the daytime. The house had been abandoned for many years until a family decided to move in, hoping for a fresh start. Everything inside looked normal at first glance, except for one thing that immediately caught their attention: the kitchen. In the center of the kitchen counter was an old glass cookie jar. It was unusually clean compared to the dusty surroundings, almost as if someone had been taking care of it. The jar had no label, no brand, and no visible lid marks of being opened recently. Yet, inside it were perfectly baked cookies that looked fresh and warm, as if they had just come out of an oven. What made it even more disturbing was the fact that no one in the house had placed those cookies there. The family assumed it was left behind by the previous owners, but there were no records of anyone living there for years. Despite this, every time someone checked the jar, it seemed full again, even after being emptied. At night, the kitchen felt different. The air grew colder, and the cookie jar sometimes made faint cracking sounds, like glass shifting slightly on its own. The family tried to ignore it, blaming stress and imagination, but a strange feeling began to grow, that the jar was not just an ordinary object. It was as if the cookie jar was watching them, silently waiting for something. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a place where something unknown was quietly beginning to awaken. The family, though a little confused by the mysterious cookie jar, tried not to think too deeply about it at first. Life in the old house had only just begun, and they convinced themselves that strange things often happen in unfamiliar places. What seemed most unusual, however, was the way the cookie jar behaved. Every night, without fail, the jar would be full again. No matter how many cookies were taken during the day, by morning it was always refilled. At first, the family thought one of them might be secretly refilling it as a joke, but soon they realized no one was doing it. There were no footsteps in the kitchen at night, no sounds of baking, and no signs that anyone was entering the house. Still, the jar remained full. The cookies themselves looked perfect, soft, warm, and freshly baked. They had a sweet smell that filled the kitchen, especially at night, as if something invisible was preparing them in silence. The family even began to argue among themselves, trying to explain the impossible. The father suggested it might be some hidden mechanism in the house, while the mother believed it could be leftover stock from an unknown source. But the children were the most curious. They started watching the jar closely, hoping to catch someone or something refilling it. Yet every attempt ended the same way. The jar would be empty after they took cookies, and then mysteriously full again the next morning. Over time, the situation stopped feeling like a harmless mystery and started feeling unsettling. It was no longer just about cookies. It was about something that was clearly happening without any logical explanation. And slowly, a quiet fear began to grow in the house, as if the jar itself was not just refilling cookies, but waiting for something in return. The youngest child in the family was the first to become truly fascinated by the cookie jar. Unlike the adults, who felt uneasy but tried to ignore it, the child saw it as something magical. The cookies always looked delicious, soft, warm, and perfectly baked, and the sweet smell that came from the jar at night made it even more tempting. At first, the child only took one cookie during the day when everyone was busy. Nothing strange happened, so the habit slowly grew. Every night, after everyone had gone to sleep, the child would quietly walk into the kitchen. The house would be completely silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. The cookie jar always seemed to be waiting. The child never told anyone about these late-night visits. It felt like a secret, something special that belonged only to them. Each time the lid was opened, the cookies inside appeared fresher and more inviting than before. Strangely, the child also noticed that the jar sometimes felt warm when touched, as if it was alive. As days passed, the child began to change in small but noticeable ways. They became more secretive, often staring at the kitchen during the night as if expecting something. Sometimes, they would wake up from sleep and sit quietly in the dark, thinking about the cookie jar. The family thought it was just a phase, nothing more than a child's innocent curiosity. But they didn't know that every cookie taken was slowly creating a bond between the child and the mysterious jar. What started as a simple midnight snack was no longer innocent. Something unseen was beginning to form, a silent connection between the child and the jar that no one in the house yet understood. As time passed, the changes in the youngest child became more noticeable and unsettling. At first, it was small things that the family tried to ignore. The child would stay awake longer than usual, sitting quietly in bed and staring at the dark corners of the room. Sometimes, they would whisper softly to themselves, as if responding to someone no one else could see. The parents thought it was just imagination or maybe a phase, but the behavior slowly grew stranger. The child began waking up in the middle of the night and walking silently toward the kitchen. No one ever heard footsteps or doors opening, yet every morning there were small signs, like the kitchen chair slightly moved or the cookie jar lid not fully closed. During the day, the child seemed distant, as if their thoughts were somewhere else. They would often pause mid-sentence and stare blankly, then suddenly smile for no reason. When asked about it, they would just shrug or change the topic quickly. Most disturbing of all was how the child sometimes appeared to be talking to someone in an empty room. Soft whispers could be heard late at night, but when anyone checked, there was no one there. The child always insisted they were just talking to the cookie jar, or that it listens. The family started feeling uneasy, but they still couldn't connect it to anything serious. They thought it was harmless imagination, possibly influenced by the strange but harmless-looking cookies. However, deep inside, a growing fear began to spread. Something about the jar was clearly affecting the child's mind. It was as if each cookie taken at night was not just food, but a silent invitation to something unseen. And slowly, that unseen presence was starting to take more than just attention. It was beginning to take control. One night, the mother couldn't sleep. There was a strange feeling in the house, like something was quietly watching from the kitchen. The silence felt heavier than usual, almost pressing against the walls. Unable to ignore it, she slowly got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. As she entered the kitchen, everything seemed normal at first. The dim light from the hallway fell softly on the counter, where the mysterious cookie jar still sat in its usual place. But something felt different. The air was colder, and the sweet smell of cookies was strangely absent that night. She approached the jar carefully, her eyes fixed on it. For a moment, everything was still. Then she noticed something that made her freeze. Inside the glass, instead of fresh cookies, there were faint, strange marks. They looked like tiny finger imprints, small, uneven, and pressed against the inner surface of the jar as if something had been trying to get out or get in. Her heart started beating faster. She leaned closer, trying to understand what she was seeing. The marks were not random. They looked almost human, but too small, too many, and strangely distorted. It was as if dozens of tiny hands had been trapped inside the jar at some point in time. Suddenly, a soft tapping sound came from inside the glass. The mother stepped back immediately, her breath caught in her throat. The kitchen felt colder than before, and the silence turned heavy and unnatural. She quickly turned on the main light, but when she looked again, the jar was completely normal, filled with perfect cookies, as if nothing had happened. But she knew what she saw was real, and from that moment, she could no longer convince herself that the cookie jar was just an ordinary object. After what the mother saw in the kitchen, she could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the cookie jar. The next morning, she tried to act normal, hoping it was just her imagination or a half-asleep hallucination. But deep down, she knew what she had seen was real. That night, she decided to stay awake and watch the kitchen carefully. The house was silent, and everyone else was asleep. Only the faint sound of the clock ticking filled the darkness. The cookie jar sat quietly on the counter, looking completely ordinary, almost innocent. Hours passed without anything happening. The mother began to doubt herself again, wondering if fear had played tricks on her mind. But just as she was about to relax, something changed. The air around the kitchen suddenly felt heavier. The temperature dropped slightly, and the faint smell of sweetness returned, stronger than before. The cookie jar began to look different. The glass seemed less clear, as if something inside it was moving in a space that wasn't fully visible. Then, slowly, the truth began to reveal itself. The cookie jar was not just a container, it was a prison. Inside it was something unnatural, an unseen force that fed on life energy. The cookies were not ordinary food, they were a trap. Each time someone ate one, a small part of their energy, their awareness, or even their innocence was taken in return. The faint marks she had seen earlier were not random at all. They were signs of trapped energy trying to escape. The jar was feeding on the family quietly, patiently, like something that had been waiting for years to be discovered. And the worst part was this: it had already chosen its next target. After realizing the horrifying truth about the cookie jar, the family could no longer live in peace. Fear had fully taken over the house. Every small sound at night felt like a warning. Every shadow in the kitchen looked alive. The once normal home had now become a place filled with silent terror. The parents gathered together and finally decided that the cookie jar had to be destroyed. They believed that breaking it would end whatever strange force was attached to it. They planned to do it early in the morning, before the children woke up, hoping to avoid any further danger. That night, they placed the jar on the kitchen table, preparing to end it once and for all. But as they looked at it closely, something felt wrong. The jar seemed heavier than before, almost as if it was resisting them. Inside the glass, the cookies were gone, completely replaced by darkness, as if something inside was now watching them back. The father raised his hand to strike it, but suddenly, a faint whisper filled the room. It sounded like the child's voice, but not quite human. The mother froze. The air became colder, and the lights flickered once. Before they could react, the jar vibrated slightly on its own. A deep cracking sound echoed through the kitchen, not from the glass, but from somewhere inside it. And then everything stopped. The family hesitated, confused and terrified, but it was already too late. Something had been released, or perhaps something had already escaped long ago without them noticing. The story ends with an unsettling silence in the house. The cookie jar is gone, but the feeling remains, as if whatever lived inside it is still somewhere nearby, just waiting for the next person to find it again.